Hello, this is Neo, just an average CSGO player, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be the first episode of a new series on my channel, because that's obviously what I do, just make new series and then drop the old ones and don't give anyone any information. And you probably feel like, that's fucked up. Why isn't this content creator, fucking Orwellian term, why doesn't he tell his fans who made him everything what he's doing? Because he didn't. You didn't do any of that shit. You just clicked on a video because you wanted to watch it. You didn't do it to help me. You didn't do it to make me any money. You actually don't even give me any money in most cases, except my patrons. Shout out to those people and whoever sponsors me. But you don't sponsor this exact video, so no direct sponsor shout out. So with that said, new show. It's called The Know-It-Alls of Counter-Strike. That's right. I've preempted everyone talking shit on us by doing it myself, 8 Mile style. And my guess, it is. My co-host for this one, it might even just be a two-man show going forward. We'll see. The problem is, if you're going to be a guest on this show, as the title says, you better be a motherfucking know-it-all. You can't just be some normal guy or a pro player or something like. This show isn't for people who just left-click really well. Okay, it ain't for those people. So the point of the show, though, is me and Tommy here, formerly known as Lurppis when he was a pro player in 1.6. We are know-it-alls, and more than that, we like to have the kinds of discussions that you have to be a know-it-all to have, where you just talk like broadly about like the entire history of the game, who were the better players, all this stuff. So we thought for this show, as a brief description, we'll start out actually, we're going to do some sort of big scale topics, like things that you do actually have to have watched like 15 to 20 years of the game to be able to even have an opinion on. Because I tell you what, one of the things that inspired me to make a show like this is in the world of sports media, which, you know, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's kind of like esports, to be honest. There's a few good creators and there's a lot of shit that's just very popular. One of the things that always infuriates me, because obviously I'm not an expert in most of the sports. Like, I'd like there to be like a Thorin who gives me the same kind of content I do that I could consume in sports. But so many times when I watch like shows that try to tackle big topics, like obvious examples are like, who is the best quarterback ever? You realise like 20 minutes into the discussion, like, wait a minute, let me think of the guy's age and the fact that most people don't have access to like VODs online. Or, holy shit, like, dude, they're having a discussion about like 60 years and they've watched like 15. Like, what is even the point of this? Like, it makes you just want to back out instantly because like, what's the point in this? So for this episode, we're going to start the most broad you can possibly start, which is, I was thinking about this the other day, right? When CSGO first came out, one of the areas where me and you were quite infamous is, especially I'd say the first year and a half, we panned the game pretty heavily. Like, we thought it wasn't that good a game. I mean, even on a basic engine level, it had all sorts of flaws. Obviously, things like the smoke were just shit. The Molotov was bugged. Like, there was a million problems with it. The spray used to be way worse if people don't remember. Like, there was many, many problems with the game. So as a result, we actually got a reputation early on in the game of people painted us as like haters who like couldn't adapt from 1.6, even though, by the way, the real haters just didn't ever play or watch CSGO. Like, we actually were actively watching all the fucking tournaments and doing a podcast. So even though that's unfair, the point I was going to make was the backlash that we used to always get went like this. Like, oh, you just like want the game to be 1.6, or oh, the game's only been out a year, so how could it be as good as 1.6 at the end? I mean, spoiler, 1.6 wasn't updated after about like 2003, but don't let that get in the way of your argument, guys. So anyway, it now has been almost 8 years since CSGO's been out. 1.6 was out, if we're talking about from release onwards, I think roughly like 11 and a bit years or something, maybe around that, because it was like late 2000, it came, like that part of maybe August 2000 or something, it came out, and then obviously the game competitively somewhat died around middle of 2012. Obviously there was a few tournaments after that, so we can now actually do a real contrast between the games, and from that there's so many interesting esports related discussions we can have. So first question for you here, Tommy, is now that you've seen almost 8 years of CSGO, and you obviously like, even though you weren't like the most OG in 1.6, if people don't know, before you were like a top pro player, you were still working as a journalist and stuff. So you watched like generally back to the early 2000s, right?
Yeah, I think the first CPL that I watched was summer 2002. So since then, I've basically watched all the big tournaments.
Yeah, that's basically, you only missed like a year or so, basically.
Yeah, that was the Game Online SK final. So it's the first like big final that I watched. So I've basically seen all the big tournaments since then, give or take.
Yes. If people don't know, piece of trivia, that's the tournament where Heaton did the famous like smoke flake flash on Element on Nuke in the final to like, it wasn't like the winning round, I don't think, but it was like, it was obviously a baller move at the time. Yep. Right, here's the question then. Now that you have seen almost 8 years of CSGO, first of all, how does CSGO as a game shape up? Like, if CS 1.6 didn't exist, how has it improved? How do you enjoy it? Has it improved? What do you think of CSGO at the moment?
I think CSGO just took massive leaps forward around a couple of years after the release. I think that the first big thing was just people forget that early on when we started watching games through streams, it was just a horrible experience. It was only after we got X-ray and all these different things and production quality went up and you started getting replays, etc., that it became a lot more palatable. But one of the biggest problems early on wasn't even necessarily CSGO related, though there was a lot of flaws there as well. But just the fact that everything basically, as we moved over to CSGO, that's basically when we just lost access to GoTV or HLTV prior to that. Yes. And honestly, I like, you just don't see the game when you're watching a stream. You see, I make the joke sometimes that you at most see 1/10 of what happens because you're watching one player at a time. But when you're watching yourself, at least, the way I used to watch as a former player, is you're just kind of frantically clicking around the whole time so that you get a better sense of what's going on all around the map. Now, you could never do that as the spectator. Remember the early CSGO majors, I think when we were casting, we actually controlled some of the computers and got complaints because we were just clicking around. Observers back then, because you were an observer as well at the time. But I mean, that's already a big change. So I think that's just made the spectator experience a lot better. I think the game itself has also improved significantly. Early on, spraying was impossible. One tapping was that's basically all you could do. There was no bursting. You couldn't tap. It was just the one tap or the recall just went crazy. Very few players knew how to use any of that. Ops were basically just super overpowered early on, because that was the only gun with no recoil. Nobody has really mastered recoil except Get Right. The spectator mode is better. Molotovs were completely broken. People don't even remember, for the first year, you had that glitch at the end of the game where once GoTV disconnected from the server, when the game ended, you knew that the game ended because of the little lag. Yes. So every single time when there's a 15-14 game, sometime during the final round, whether the game ended or, whether it's going to OT. So I think it's just taken leaps. I think it's gotten a lot better. I think they've done, both on the game side, but also on the production side and everything around it, everything has just taken massive leaps forward. Obviously the game itself, if you're just comparing game to game, don't know that it's that much different. I do think there's more tactical depth because of Molotovs, etc., which I very much appreciate nowadays. And the skill level has obviously gone up pretty significantly on an individual level. But most of the benefits, I think, are actually just outside of the game itself. Just, how the broadcast looks, etc. It's just very different from early on. And I think people just don't necessarily even remember, wearing around to see what it all used to look like at the time.
Yeah, that's actually one of the first things I was going to kind of compliment the game on in terms of improvement is people will take for granted how good GoTV actually is. It's fucking amazing. Essentially, let's be real, there are almost no POVs filmed. All those frag movies we've seen, which, by the way, you don't think of it when you watch it, this was from GoTV. They look fucking sick. It looks like it is a POV done. And the reason why that's significant is we come from 1.6 where, to this day, HLTV is fucked. It's lagged as fuck. It's very rare you ever had a HLTV demo that wasn't laggy. True, a lot of them were recorded online with internet connections, but it used to be terrible. Dude, you remember especially, if you're trying to watch someone who's like an opera or something, you may as well not be watching. It's like watching stuttering, freeze frame or something, it's terrible. It used to be really bad to watch. So as a result, you needed the POV demo back then, otherwise you're never going to properly enjoy the game. You can actually take it for granted now. It's brilliant. It works the way it should do. Similarly, I agree with you, by the way.
POVs anymore.
You don't need them, yeah. I'd also say as well, by the way, I'd kind of tie it in the game and out of the game. One thing I was mad underwhelmed with early in the game is, as you said, I'll be real, Get Right was the only player that knew how to properly spray. It's not even a joke. The early on, for maybe the first 6 months, there would be a final of a LAN would have moments where two players sat literally in the game 5 meters away from each other, sprayed, and sometimes someone didn't get the kill. And I used to watch this going first of all, these aren't nobodies. That's Forest, and that's fucking, RPK or something. These guys were the goats of their game. What, they can't even spray in this game. And so I will say, even though I think back then it made me think the engine was shit, that's one thing where I actually think also that unlike 1.6, where a lot of that was I always say it's very intuitive, a lot of that people picked up very quickly. I assume some of it in CSGO is unlearning bad habits, because I tell you what, eventually, just look at people like Elige or something like that. They are Magisk. They are unbelievable at spraying now. Dude, their spray, I always tell people, if you've watched 1.6, you really appreciate their spray, because their spray looks like they're doing it on the 1.6 engine. Like the way they sprayed M4A4, it's the same thing. It's so crisp. You get most of the bullets on the guy. Because that's also one area. I'll tie it into where you say like the tactical depth. Because I notice actually a lot of people, even people from 1.6 like Ave, think CSGO is actually more tactically deep. And I think part of that's in the game and out of the game. Like on the one hand, I definitely agree. Smokes and Molotovs are such game changers. Clearly in CSGO, that changes the way tactically you play. But then I also think like, some of that's also the fact that, like, to be fair, we didn't have like tons of coaches and staff and data, and no one was like stuck. Like people back then, even Ave used to like, he had notes written from past demos, but he would just watch like the most recent demo you played and then see what he could take from that. So I also think, to be fair, we've upgraded a lot of the ancillary stuff that makes tactics more viable.
Same as production, basically. Like all the support systems have gotten a lot better.
And the problem is, I would just say it's more tactically deep in a different way, because the way I think it will never match 1.6 in terms of tactical depth is the reason why, and this is why I was surprised Dave was actually so willing to go deep on this one, is remember, MTW, along with the fucking Korean Eastro team, are the one that have those legendary videos on YouTube where they have every pop flash when they do like the Inferno takes. And obviously they all have it, like they have it timed out. It's like someone running like a wide receiver route in the NFL. They run the exact same route every time so that you can throw the flashes where they need to be, just like the quarterback throws to that spot, even if he can't see you there, you know. So the reason why I bring that up is, there's a reason we don't have that in CSGO, Ave, and it isn't because the game's so deep, everyone's learned and upgraded or whatever the fuck every commentator tells me every 6 months. It's because in 1.6, a guy who's really good sitting at that corner with his M4A4, A1 silenced, will just spray all of you down if you come round without the right flashes and utility, even though the utility was worse. So I'll say in a different sense, it's more deep. In that sense, that's why I actually think he had a lot more executes. Because even killing those two guys in the B bomb site on fucking Inferno's harder than CS 1.6. Like, they have the counter flashes. Everyone's seen those frag movies where you just spray everyone down from the arch, like that fucking Fury guy. That was all he did, basically. Like 95% of his frag movie was him and a Swedish fucking gather just spraying down 5 ecoing terrorists running in there. Like, you couldn't kill people in that sense. So, like, I agree. I'd push back a little bit, but I think it's different. It's deep in a different way. You know what I mean?
I actually think like one part of it is that in CSGO you kind of have to play the way that I remember our teams used to play against a bunch of the CIS teams, not Navi, but like some of the other teams that more relied on skill and didn't really play very tactical Counter-Strike, which is that if your opponents are very skilled or they just play kind of freewheeling style, then if you play very sort of execute heavy style where, you know, you're very set in your motions and how you go about everything, then that's easier to counter. Yes. And then like once one thing goes wrong, it usually snowballs, and it's a lot harder to sort of recover from that. So, you know, if you play more free and more default, which is the direction that the game has been going for a long period of time, and part of it is just lack of leaders today, to be honest.
Yes.
When that happens, you're actually better off in a sick, twisted way, just not even learning some of the executes in the first place. Because if they only work out half the time, given that one thing that could happen in mid-round goes wrong, it might actually not be worth doing that. Because then the other half of the time, you're not going to be as well prepared as if you were playing that way to begin with. Plus, you know, Peeker's advantage in CSGO obviously makes a big difference. And, you know, in 1.6, you could spam through corners if people peeked. In CSGO, you have the advantage when you peek, and then you can also just basically continuously keep hiding behind corners. So jiggle peeking is just like an entirely different animal than it was in 1.6, where you just get blasted through the wall unless it's against an op.
Yeah, that's actually one reason. I can already draw a historical comparison for people here, right? Back in the day when I did an interview with, I forget who it actually is. I think it actually might have actually been Ave himself, who was obviously the MTW Denmark in-game leader. I think when I asked him in an interview why he thought that the team that came the next year, Fnatic 2009, because his MTW team was the best in 2008, when I asked him basically, why were they not only the team that supplanted you, but if you remember famously, they sort of hard counted that lineup. Like, even though that lineup, when they were the best, they were kind of like Astralis now. They were like so tactical. Everyone kind of knew how to lurk and play off each other on the map. Like, very radical approach to the game, just as Astralis has been in this like sort of GOAT era. When I asked him, because I was obviously puzzled, like I thought that was the best team I'd ever seen until I saw the Fnatic team smash him. And his reasoning basically was similar to what you're saying. He basically said, whereas all the other teams just tried, for example, like if we had good flashes, they tried to have the counter flash, or they tried to read the strat as to what it is. He said what would happen is when we would be on the T side and we were setting up for the execute, the Fnatic players famously didn't play around a lot of utility because there was such a loose team. So they would just push into you and you just have a flash in your hand and like Forest would just bang you in the face instantly and go back around the corner. So it's like, you can see how that would absolutely hard counter like an execute style. So where I'll tie that to the modern CSGO is this is why a lot of people are confused as to why I was sort of riding Team Liquid last year so hard. And it's because, to me, logically, especially in CSGO, if Team Liquid hadn't have basically been kind of a bit pussy at times, if they'd have really believed they were better than Astralis, I actually think stylistically the same scenario should have worked. They should basically, with their raw skill, have been able to overpower Astralis. Because if you remember, one of the things when they were in that summer run winning all the events that was amazing about them is even though they came after Astralis, who like, you know, half of why they won the events is they would always be top in utility rating, Team Liquid used to be like shockingly low for the team winning the event. And so the premise with them was they didn't even need the utility. They would just send 3 or 4 aimers onto your spot. And at that point in time, if you have the better aimers, you have 3 or 4 of them fighting 2 guys, you just win, don't you? Like the numbers work out. So that's one of the reasons I was always underwhelmed that Team Liquid managed to go on the opposite side. They had the stylistic counter there, and yet they themselves got countered on, I'd assume psychologically, because they lost every fucking time to Astralis after that. It's so underwhelming.
Well, the problem is when you play the individually skilled, you know, sort of freewheeling style where you don't have a lot of tactics to fall back on, is that's the style where if you're not in A shape, then you might just be absolutely garbage. The variance is much higher in how good you are. And also, if you start off poorly, it could be harder to get into the game if things start going poorly, because obviously you don't have a lot of things to fall back on that might help you get some easier kills. You know, in a heavily exaggerated example, it's basically the difference between, you know, someone pop flashing for you every time and you getting a 50-50 shot at a free kill, depending on if someone's there. When you have an idea of how the other team is playing, every now and then you're just going to get a free kill, and every now and then that'll just translate to a round or at least a free entry at a favorable situation. But if you don't do that and you always rely on the first guy going in to just get the entry kill, you know, like that's just a lot more pressure on that guy to hit his shot or someone to trade that kill. Whereas you don't actually have to win all the time. You might be the tactical team if you're able to get those flashes right, but then you still have that same shot on top. So it's just, like, it's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but that's like the exaggerated version of like why it's just so much harder to rely on that over and over and over again.
That makes me think of a pretty good sort of question to ask you generally, like an abstract question, but one that you can pick if you want examples or something, right? Why do you think it is in CS? Because now that I've seen this many years of CS, I realize this is just the way players are. Like players tend to all conform to a fairly similar, like narrow, like usually even personality type, like background. Like it's not actually as diverse as people imagine when they try to like sell that angle that like everyone's fucking working out or whatever. But one thing I've always found so underwhelming about Counter-Strike as a game is one thing I've never understood in video games, dude. It's why when I was the IGL, I used to be the entry as well. Because I never understood this idea that I'm scared to die in video games. It's like the people, you remember when StarCraft and League of Legends came out and people were like, I have ladder anxiety. I can't click the button to play laddered because I might lose points. I used to think like, is something wrong with you, mate? Like, if I go down on the ladder, I'd just assume I'm not playing well or I'm not as good at the game. Like, I would never be scared to press the button to play the game. That's such a weird modern anxiety. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, dude, I know this used to tilt you when you were a pro player, so I want to tie it into this. I'm amazed because the Team Liquid example I think is a good one. You know, I always preach this, that one of the things I hate about Team Liquid in CSGO is specifically against Astralis, probably the worst team in the game to go slow against. They always, when they panic, start to go slower and slower and basically play like a shit version of Astralis, which that's hard enough anyway. But then if you're playing Astralis when you do it, like you're almost just giving them the game at that point. You're like, you just choose what I'm going to do every round and how I'm going to have to react to you. So one thing I don't get right is when I have a team like Team Liquid, if I was their coach, my entire mantra would be like, who cares if you die? Like the guy behind you, if you give him the information or you damage the guy, he's a fragger, so he's going to kill him as well. Like I would preach like almost like a Viking fucking like berserker mode, you know, where it's like we just rush in the sights and we never worry about dying. Don't you find it amazing? Because I know some of your teammates used to be like this, that even on a pro level, do people actually play like it? Like, you know, if you used to play in a POG, no one would ever go in first, would they? If it's just a pickup game because you're not a team. I'm amazed how many teams have players who do that sometimes in pro games. Like some guy just won't go in first, even if he knows that that's probably the right style for us. What do you think it is?
Well, for more than a decade ago, like you said, that I've had some teammates who basically refused to partake in, some spawn-based tactics that might involve them going in first and basically just being the sacrificial lamb in rushes and executes. We had that joke in many of my teams where I said, like, listen, dude, you're not actually dying. Like their character dies and then you respawn. They're not even dying the game. You just respawn in like a minute and you get to play again. I honestly don't know. I do think that a big portion of that is honestly statistics. People just care so much about them, which is crazy. Because remember, the stats only started coming out a couple of years into when I started playing professionally. So initially, it was just limited number of tournaments that were on GovRag. And then AWPing only came out with stats like years later. And many of the tournaments that were, unfortunately, we don't have 1.6 stats anymore, but many of the 1.6 tournaments that were later on added to AWPing actually came years after the fact. But in reality, I think they only started covering stats from like 2009, 2010 onwards. And everything else until then was just like scarce. The biggest international tournaments that GovRag happened to cover and like select American tournaments. So I think there was a pretty big change in like how people played, frankly, from the point onwards that stats started coming out. Because like that, it just, to this day, people just look at stats and they see the plus or minus number. And if it's green, they're happy. And if it's red, they're not happy. And that's just how they kind of evaluate it. I will say that I think playing prior to that was more enjoyable. At the same time, like it's honestly just so beyond mind-bogglingly stupid that people look at that so much and care so much about it. It's one thing to say that you don't care about stats or like you don't think they're relevant, but like then you actually have to act on that, which is the part where I think many people have a disconnect.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Like that is obviously a factor.
That's not on the stats up before I forget. Is the other piece is that a lot of the players, and I think this is even more the case today. The example I like to use for this is like, in anything competitive, the people who have the most talent end up being the best. I could be, 50% smarter than Forrest, but he has way more just raw talent than I do for aiming. It's just much more skilled than I will ever be. So it doesn't matter how much smarter I am at some point, because he's just going to be better because he has better aims. It's why J.R. Smith plays in the NBA, regardless of what happened in the finals a couple of years back. He just has more talent than the next guy, even though, probably not the smartest guy on the floor.
Of course.
But many of the players, and this is at least from my teams, like many of the players, they just don't understand what the implications are. Like they can't process it in real time. So when they see someone dying and that person just needs to go, and it might be a sub 50% proposition. It might be more likely that they die than that it works out. But if you understand the big picture, you might know that that's still the only way to win the round. Because otherwise, rotations happen or something else happens around the map. That's the part that I think most players don't understand. And I think today, like if you look at how good individually, how skilled players are, how good the average player is these days, it seems pretty obvious to me that I think more and more of the players at the top tend to be the super skilled and talented ones, as opposed to necessarily the ones who really understand the game, which is also why I think there's such a big premium on in-game leaders nowadays. And I think that's a big part of it. I think people just honestly don't understand. I think very few people truly understand how the game works. And by the way, I don't even understand how the game works anymore.
Yeah, of course.
I was talking to Forrest about this at I think it was Blast Moscow. After the tournament, we were having a couple of drinks, and like he asked me how I feel watching the game nowadays, and I was like, "Listen, dude, like I don't understand half the stuff. And the way I know that I don't understand half the stuff is every now and then I see something, and I'm like, and I recognize it. I'm like, how did I just now recognize it? Because like all of this stuff used to happen normally. Back when I played, I would see one flash coming from one direction, and I would know where that's going to lead because I've seen thousands and thousands of repetitions of the same stuff, the same thing. And like, you don't see that anymore. One, and two, you definitely don't see that anymore when you're not playing and you're not watching on AWPing, where you get to click around and see much more.
Yes. Oh, by the way, what I'll say about that as well is, to be fair, that's actually the best counter to what I just said when I contrasted like Team Liquid Astralis with the Fnatic MTW. Put it this way, if I think about it, there's one position that is unfair to make that comparison, which is if MTW had Ave, the best tactical in-game leader, Fnatic still had fucking Khan, who was one of the best loose-style fragging in-game leaders. That's where actually my Team Liquid Astralis comparison falls down. IGL position is the most imbalanced of that one. Like, yeah, Team Liquid has more skill, but tell you what, Nitro is not a comparable to Glaive. As in, he's not even the best at his style to be... that's why I think the comparison in CSGO has always been Carrigan Glaive. Like, that's like the loosest, like, in-game leader calling style versus, because they're both just like masters of it, aren't they? So actually, to be fair, it makes more sense that actually the counter works the other way around in CSGO. Because, like, it's not really a fair fight if you don't have, like, the best loose IGL, you know, if you want to beat the best tactical IGL.
Yeah, and like you never know from the outside like what their contributions are really, right? Like it's impossible to know how.
Well, luckily now, at some of those blast events,
yeah, I mean now we know.
could actually hear shit. Yeah, that was straight fire.
We've had pushback previously when we've suggested like, oh, you know, like David Nitro is not the best in-game leader. Well, like you tell me, like that's. You tell me. I don't know. I haven't played with him. I have no idea.
Put it this way.
But like clearly he's not super appreciated by his own teammates, regardless of what was said previously.
Here's the best way to say it. I can't know what he did in past years. Like for that, I have to go off like ZywOo, some people who I know who were in the team who told me, like, for example, they said in 2018 he was actually very good and he kind of like was in tune with the coach, etc. The problem is, right, I could believe in 2019 he did a good job because you just don't win that many tournaments if you're a bad IGL. That is impossible. But I will say, I only heard him in 2020, obviously, at this Blast event. All I'll say is this. I suspect personally that Stewie2K was already the IGL back then, because Stewie2K already was the vocal one. He was the one talking way more. He was sort of calling his own players. Like, that made me, when I listened to that, I remember thinking, like, have I just found out, like, Santa Claus isn't real or something? What the fuck is this? Like, where's Nitro? Like, I know what his voice sounds like. Where's Nitro? He's not saying anything. But anyway, to put that to one side, I thought a cool question that we could topic that we could tackle for this episode, because it ties into this, is another area where, because you know, back in the day when I used to always do those like yearly AMAs on Reddit, and I obviously was one of the few people who, I mean, you kind of copy my style as well, where you don't just do it to do a 1 sentence answer, like, haha, I think Device is the best AWPer. Like, that just means nothing. Like, you want to know why you think the best. So I famously always would write big, long answers because I wanted to do it comprehensively, right? And one of the things I noticed when I did these AMAs is it's no wonder people always thought I wanted the game to be 1.6, because if it ever came to contrasting players, even though I'm with you, just like sports, obviously the science of the game improves. So yes, the best aimers today, for a start, if they have a mouse that's 10 times better than the one that like Neo had. So for many obvious reasons, and they can play all day, they're professionals, they have coaches, facilities, there's a million reasons why they are more skilled. But one issue I always had was, if we're talking relative to their era, up until basically, I'll just be honest, up until basically s1mple went God mode, I would never have ever even entertained the heresy of saying a CSGO player was better than the true gods of 1.6. I would always have said, listen, you know, fucking at the time, Get Right, Olaf Meister, Kenya, they're all brilliant CSGO players, but if you saw what Neo, Forest, Markov, if you saw them at their peak, I'm sorry, but relative to their games, that they were better. Like what they did was harder, it was more skilled. The interesting thing about s1mple, Nico, this kind of class of people that have come up, the mad skill, but ZywOo, the interesting thing about these players to me is we can now have that discussion. Like, what are the peak CSGO players, the best, most skilled, top, like the ones that just look like gods, essentially? I feel like they finally truly gotten to the level that it felt like when you had Neo, you know, where like, it felt like every tournament, those guys, like a bad tournament for them was to be like the 5th best player in the tournament. Like, their consistency was really nuts. If you talk, especially Neo and Markov, like these guys had years where they were just every tournament, you could just bank on them being the MVP. I feel like actually the s1mples and Nikos, they deserve to be in this conversation now. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think ZywOo was probably the best comp for Neo, actually, just keeping in mind like his team and everything around him relative to him.
Sure.
I think he's probably the best comp if we think in that regard. I think, you know, I think Nico might actually be the closest to Markelov, not even playing style, but in just like consistency, except for the last, like, I don't know, some number of months when he
phoned it in a bit, yeah.
But outside of that, like, I think he might be the most consistent potentially. I guess Coldzera up there as well, but he just hasn't been around for as long. I think Forrest at his peak probably has the highest just like pure skill that I've ever seen. I don't know, I might be biased on that.
Above s1mple? To be fair, you did play against Forrest, whereas you didn't play against s1mple, so I will just add that in. Yeah. But you think it's higher than s1mple?
I think the other. It's hard to say. I put it this way. I think Forrest has the most aesthetically pleasing style.
Okay, I'm with you on
There's
that.
no question about that. I think s1mple is probably up there in terms of like pure skill. Like some of the stuff that he does, ZywOo too, and I think Nico as well. Like some of the stuff that they do, and it's just unreal. You know, some of the, like many of the things that these guys pull off, particularly with like save rounds with Beagles, like you just wouldn't even ever try that.
Oh, dude,
you didn't even see anybody try that in the past.
Here's the brutal comparison.
The craziest part.
Here's how you know, as you said, I mean, you described it perfectly if anyone was from 1.6, which is that everyone in CSGO, the basic meta is like how CIS teams used to play in CS 1.6, where if people don't know, because the economy was different, they played as though we had this economy. Like, they played as though there was like reset rounds, and if you bought deagles and shot everyone, you just changed the whole economy. Like, and as a result, they would just buy the deagles, and then the Swedish guys would just spray them down with Colts and just lose the fucking round. Then they'd buy deagles 2 more times, and then buy an AWP on the 5th round or whatever. It's like, so they were really bizarre. So I get you on that one, but in line with that, actually, there's one thing I have to say that the modern CS classic players, that especially particularly s1mple, do not live up to the billing of the gods of 1.6, is there were no gods in 1.6 who had like fundamentally bad like positioning, decision making. Like, it goes without saying, like all the players we're going to list, like even Forrest, people like to talk about Forrest's aim. Forrest had the slickest mechanics ever in 1.6. Like, he would also dock jump the best, like the Russian walking style. He would peek the corner perfectly. He was just so smooth. Whereas if you think of s1mple is constant. It's one of the reasons why until he was the best, people used to criticize him. He's constantly putting himself in scenarios that actually are bad situations, even for him sometimes, but then fragging his way out of it. Yeah, absolutely.
s1mple's reckless. Forrest and Neo both, I would say, at their peak, like they just made it look easy because they made the right decisions. So they didn't even put themselves in like hard situations a lot of the time.
They're more comparable to like coldzera and Eco. Yeah, I'm with you on that. But here's the thing. This is what I was going to make the point of. One of the whole reasons why me and you have often bemoaned that even though we know that Rui was one of the great players, there's a reason why he wouldn't be in anyone's top 5 list in the history of the game. Because in 1.6, that wasn't actually rewarded as much. Like, as we famously used to say, yeah, he'll win you the game and then also lose you another game. And it might even be the same move that won or lost each game, you know what?
In the same game, he might have basically won you the game when the other team's broke, and then he might lose you the next round. That's happened too.
But the thing is, actually, that's more s1mple-esque in some ways, you know, not the lose the game part, but as in like the pure aggression, putting yourself in crazy, reckless scenarios. I feel like CSGO definitely rewards that more.
Yeah, if he came around 10 years later, I think he would have been incredibly good in CSGO. I mean, he actually tried to play for a little bit. He'd just been gone for too long at that point. It would have been too much work to get started. And I also just think, like, frankly, I think a big part of why everybody's getting better in terms of just like raw talent is like, listen, when people started playing 1.6, like, there literally were only ball mice like 2 years before. I think optical mice only came out like during the early versions of Counter-Strike, and like no human being on the planet had used mice for like years and years. Like, it was like a foreign concept that they started adapting. So, you know, unsurprisingly, now that it's like an extension to people's hands and arms, people feel more comfortable and start to reach higher peaks. Like, that's just kind of how evolution works.
Sure. Because along those lines, actually, when you say that you think like Forrest's peak was higher, one area I could actually sort of like agree with you is because in 1.6, first of all, we had no broken pistol meta. Pistols were just something you used because you were equaling. That's it. And you did not expect to get a kill. You tried to, but you didn't expect to. Whereas obviously we know from the CZ onwards, there has constantly been at least one broken pistol in CSGO at all times. And as a result, I mean, it goes without saying, in theory, you shouldn't be able to be as dominant a rifle player if people can just be stood behind the corner with the CZ and another guy in a crossfire with the CZ. Like, nobody can kill all those people every time. Like, in 1.6, those scenarios don't happen. So it's a bit more streamlined. Like, on the ecos, you clean up. On the other rounds, you don't. It's one of the reasons why, famously, one of the areas I found a way to defend Device, actually, the last few years, when people used to say he baited, etc., is, you know, when, like, even other pro players would say, oh, he just gets all eco kills. I was like, dude, what the fuck is an eco kill? Like, there's nobody with just Glocks in CSGO. It happens, like, what, 2 rounds a game? Like, you're making it sound like he just shoots 5 people who can't shoot him. I said, you know what? You're inadvertently telling me why he's better than you. If he can clean up all the 4 or 5 people who rush him every time when he's got a fucking AWP and they've got CZs and they're bomb rushing him, that's a mad valuable tool in CSGO. Like, that's like implied value you're really downplayed if people hate on that. So in that sense, if you are a Forrest and Neo Marklov, the resources just go a lot further. Like, a gun goes a lot further in 1.6.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Markelov was the one player, I think probably the only operator. I think Delpan at his peak, but that was like, 6 months, not like years and years, was similar. But he was like the only guy who just didn't miss So like he was the guy you just like couldn't play against without like 10 walls of smokes and a million flashes, and you might just not even get a shot. He was like the only player who was like that in the game. Everybody else, like even, Forrest would have those games where you could just tell from like the pistol onwards he was going to get 35 kills, and like that was just going to be game, and there was nothing you could do because that would just happen every now and then. But he'd be immortal here and there too, and you just be able to beat them because you just basically bait them into running into you. Nowadays, I think you just don't get those. There's no like easy kills. First of all, like you said, everybody's buying something at all times. There's no easy kills at all. I do think that also, like, somewhat counterintuitively makes everything even more random, because given that you can't just play like passive and far away and play quote unquote safe, that's not an option that doesn't exist. That's not part of CSGO. There is no safe in the game. So as a result, like there really is no reason to necessarily play that. Like there's like a justification for being more aggressive and playing more dangerously. And I think that's sort of like a loop that I think makes the game in some ways a bit more random. But yeah, I mean, like you said, like the players who can clean up and who can be really good are even better. I would say that that's like one of the reasons though why I think the hybrids tend to be the best players. I think like, even cold op sometimes, Nico's the best when he's opping some of the time, like Device is the best when he's opping some of the time, rifling some of the time. Same for s1mple. ZywOo's, I guess, the most like pure opper out of all those, even more so than Device. But, like that's the flexibility that you would want. In 1.6, it was less start. Like all the best players would also op. Like Neo would famously just like tell his opper, just get out of the way and op when the games got close, because he was the best player. So he was also the best opper. And I think that's actually fairly similar, given that like that just allows you to do things that you otherwise can't, and also speaks to like the skill gap even between teams, I think.
Yeah, because actually, even though like this might sound weird, but even though on the one hand, if you put s1mple in 1.6, like I'll give him two things to his credit. One, first of all, with the no scopes that are accurate. If you see what he does in CSGO, like that would be the most broken shit maybe ever. Because he actually, the old criticism that Valve used when they nerfed the AWP, which I never agreed with because it wasn't true. Basically, they probably just watched Fnatic win those tournaments at the end of 2014 because they said the problem with the AWP is it's become a mobile shotgun. It's like, no, there's a guy called JW does that. No one else in the whole game does. Like, what are you talking about? Like, no one's using it.
That's how everything works. That's why it rolls around Shaq. Like everything. There's one person who breaks it, and then you have to adjust around it.
But even so, I agree. If s1mple had played with an AWP like 1.6, dude, he wouldn't even bother scoping, would he? He hates every no scope anyway.
Also imagine the pre, I think it was 2003 patch up where you didn't have to delay when you were switching guns.
It was even better in 1.6.
That would have actually been like unplayable these days. If you gave these guys that up, the game would just be broken. You would only op. You would never have any other gun. Ever.
Luckily, that was people with ball mice and like a fucking 5-inch mouse pad that has like a Mickey Mouse on it, like at a pro level in CPL fight. Luckily, yeah. Like if anything, the world like balanced that for us.
Yeah, I mean, you only started. Actually, I think probably the best, at least like the most like highlight-ish, realish player in that regard was Wally. Like if you look at some of his movies, the way he scrimmed with some of that, like that was broken. Yes. And like that was broken to play against. So that was actually a good patch. But yeah, I mean, like if you had that, like some of these guys would just break the game entirely because they'd be way too good at it.
So even though that factor would make s1mple in theory better than he is now, and I'll also throw in as well, one thing people don't know about s1mple, it's one of the reasons why I was actually very confident, why I have all those tweets from like 2016 where I say he's probably going to be the best player ever. The reason why I was sort of so early on s1mple to not just be like a sick player, but like be maybe the best, is because I also knew from his Team Liquid days that this guy was mad dedicated. Like he was a guy where even when he would matchmake, dude, he would do exactly what you say, but no one does. Like he would matchmake with purpose. Like he would matchmake to practice certain grenades on a position or to like try and properly hold a spot. So in my opinion, if you have that formula, the reason why he plays essentially what you did in CSGO is it works, called like abusive, like take spots you shouldn't take, but then as a result make it work. In theory, is because he learned from trial and error that for him that works. So I've got to say, even though if you put s1mple now from CSGO tomorrow into 1.6, he will instantly not be at the level of Neo and Forrest because his style would get crushed. I'm going to go ahead and give him the credit. I think if he played the game long enough, he would just also learn the more safe, like positioning-based style like everyone else did in 1.6. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's just a grinder. People like him tend to end up being the best. Like he just cares about playing and cares about that more than anything else. It seems it's really remarkable. It's impossible not to respect the time that he puts in. To your point about like using pugs as practice, I think that's something that people still don't always sort of get. And I mean, the problem with that is like if you have 3 people doing that, it kind of breaks the game, right? Because everybody's doing dumb stuff. It only works like one person doing that. And one person doing that kind of ruins the experience for the others some of the time. But like, I actually remember I first read that from, it was a player on a team called DKH. I think the player whose interview was on, the German team. I think it's one of the players whose clip is on Frag or Die when he runs out at Aztec. Yeah, it might have been his. I think it was his interview where like he said this was, like literally like 18 years ago, something like that, where he said like, listen, like, the reason that you just rush out double doors every round in like a pub or something is just like, what else are you learning? Like, that's the only way that you can challenge yourself. And like, I remember reading that. I was like, yeah, like that makes sense. Like, if you're just holding out flashes and like killing blind people in pubs, then like, what are you doing? Like, you don't need to practice that. Like, if that's how you're playing, then you're not actually getting anything out of it. Then like, just go play deathmatch. But like, that's why I've always thought that even playing pugs with like your friends, because that's the kind of environment where you can be the guy who kind of abuses everything else and does whatever you want, and everybody else is still kind of happy because you're winning and you're playing with your buddies. Like, that's actually, I think, like a very good environment to try to improve as a player, which seems to be the sort of thing that people like s1mple who just like stream FPL, etc. do. Now again,
Cold Zero as well. There's a few of them. Yeah.
Like, not everybody can do that. Like, I imagine when some of like the youngsters in FPL do that, like that's when they get a lot of complaints and everybody else is like, what are you doing? Like, this is not your place. But yeah, I mean, that's absolutely like how you get better. And it makes perfect sense that he would have also learned to play the way the 1.6 works. I mean, like, look, like he's not playing this way if this game is 1.6. In fact, no one is playing this way because you can play this way. It's like fundamentally many of the things are different. So I have no reason to expect that the skills and talent that he has wouldn't have translated over. Just as everybody else. Now, like I will say though that like obviously like some skills probably benefit more from one game rather than the other. Like I think Markelov would always be better at 1.6 with his style. Like he's so passive, like that was just never going to be able to translate like incredibly well. Like he could have been like a turret on CT sides, but like T sides, like his style, like it would have been just hard to make work unless he just had like his team around it setting him up every single round. But that's just like not realistic the way CSGO is being played. And it has been played for quite a while. But then, if you're super reckless, like JW in 1.6 would have just gotten smoked.
He'd be a clown, wouldn't he?
Yeah, and I'm guessing that he probably did. Like he was playing 1.6.
True.
Towards the end of it. So like there's like some benefits that I think would have made s1mple better in CS:GO just from a stylistic perspective. But like I have at least like the way he plays today. But like I also think that his style would be entirely different had he played in the 1.6 era, because he would have just like learned completely different habits and made the most out of those.
Sure. I mean, I will say, like, if you're just like a good CS pro and you're playing either matchmaking or with friends and you're like dropping 40 and thinking it's hilarious, that is just like going and fucking dunking on a bunch of like fucking third graders or something. If you're like an NBA pro, like, doesn't really mean anything, does it? You're not improving. Like, you're just dunking on a bunch of kids. Like, so here's one thing though. If we go the other way on great players, I tell you what, if we're going to pick out the greatest CSGO players ever, the two that immediately come to mind, dude, that I think would be, I'm obviously not going to include a Get Right, who was a great 1.6 player, but Nico and Cold Zero, mate, I could drop them tomorrow in 1.6, and they're fucking like awareness for like angles, positional play, how consistent they are, the fact that they're both grinders, and I think they would be amazing 1.6 players.
Yeah, I think they basically are 1.6 players stuck in CSGO.
Cold Zero, I always think just looks like a 1.6 player.
Both of them are actually very similar to Neo, I think.
Yes.
In how they play, or how Neo played back in the 1.6 days. Like they're just smart, methodical. They kind of play any, like any role, very versatile as players, and they just like play smart. They're both just like very smart. They make the game easy for themselves.
Agreed. I also think if you want to go, like, we're still talking great players, but a little bit further down. An obvious name that comes out to me would be someone like Crims. Mate, Zipnix would be a monster in 1.6. Like, if you play positionally and you're good in clutches, I've got a game for you. It's called CS 1.6. You're going to fucking love it. There's no guy just behind you through a smoke with a CZ. Like, if you can play positionally, you can play that game for a long time, no matter what your aim's like.
Yeah, no, I mean, those are the kind of players that I think would benefit the most from just more of a positional play. The players who have the best fundamentals, they would have they would have been better off and vice versa. Because obviously, like if you're super reckless in 1.6, you're going to get blasted. I think in CSGO, you probably benefit on a relative basis from that. And on the other hand, like just fundamentals are not as valuable in CSGO as they were in 1.6.
Yes. Because one thing I always found actually sad, this is another thing that put me off CSGO when it first came out. If you remember, two of the lineups that just transitioned the entire lineup to CSGO was Na'Vi and it wasn't Virtus Pro back then. It was like, I think they were maybe ESC was what they were called back then when it was like the Poles basically.
Yep.
If you remember, they just took the 1.6 lineups and just started playing CSGO like DreamHack Winter or whatever and beyond. Now, one of the saddest things ever was early on seeing Senya and Lord just be absolute shit in CSGO and just being like, what the fuck? These guys were... They basically, if you don't know, if you didn't watch 1.6, they were the Zipnixes of that game. Like, even though there were supportive elements that got no resources and all the shit roles, they just did their job. Like, they would win clutches, they would just perform. They basically did what Zipnix does. It gives you like an OP advantage at, in theory, the weakest position. And then in CSGO, these guys tried to play positionally and thought like, haha, I will use a position over his aim. And then the guy would just jiggle peek the corner and bang him in the head. And obviously, you can't even wall bang him when he goes back behind the wall. Like, they were just getting abused, dude. And I remember thinking, like, this game sucks. Obviously now, like I say, I still don't think it's as good if I'm being honest, but I think it's just good in different ways. I think that's the way I rationalise it in my mind, because my problem is this. As much as people will say, guys, it's been 8 years, like stop talking about 1.6, it's just nostalgia. You've done the same as me, mate. Anyone who's a 1.6 pro, do yourself a favour. When you've got an off day, install 1.6 and go play some DM. The first time you play it again, the engine's like, oh my God, it feels amazing. It feels amazing, doesn't it? Like, I'm not nostalgic, remember it, didn't you say?
Everything is just so crisp. Everything, like,
yes.
Everything registers feels like to the millisecond. Like, when you press keys, like, everything is instantaneous. And, like, the recoil, like, everything just feels so good in that game. And I mean, obviously, like, for me, a big part of it is that I just suck at CSGO, at least relative
sure.
to that. But, like, it just feels more precise.
Yes. What about if we go the other way, though? What great 1.6 players do you think... I already gave Rui, it's not a bad call. Who's some other good 1.6 pros who you think like their game would just be... It might be even better in CSGO if we think of their strengths. Like who are people who play aggressively or abuse the pistols or whatever? Who would you pick out that you think you'd put over?
Someone who's not going to be like a super incredibly well-known or popular player, but I think would have been super good if he just started playing instantly is Basic. I think he was like a very aggressive, like entry type player who's versatile, could play with an op and everything else. It's like very smart player as well. He started playing poker at the end of 1.6, so then like he made like a bit of a comeback like 2 years later, but it was too late. But I think he's someone whose skill set would have been really good had he just transferred over right off the bat. But he's also one of the guys who gave it a go and played a couple months and just didn't like how he felt and thought he had other options and wasn't forced to play, so he just didn't. Let me think for a second just to see who else would have been. The problem is that many of the players that you think would have been good gave it some kind of a shot at some point.
Sure.
When the money started coming in and the skins made everything much bigger and everybody started getting paid lots of money, etc. That like kind of alters how you would think about it. So I think you'd have to go back a couple more years. Well, I think MJE, if he could have continued from like the MTW days without ever going anywhere, I think his style could have been pretty good. He was pretty aggressive and he had good aim. He has like a normal professional career too now. And I think
if people don't know,
I think Wimp could have been like the Zipnix, but I think better actually. If
he'd still been playing. Yeah. If people don't know, MG, who was a player for the MTW team with Wimp and Ave and Sonic and all those guys, one of the things about his style of play was, I mean, Lurppis himself knows this, it took a lot of years before that guy. He had to get a lot of accomplishments before anyone respected him, because basically his style of play, remember, this is a game where you aren't rewarded for Stewie2K style play. Everyone used to just think of him like Stewie2K in the early days. When everyone hated him before he was a pro player, because he was like the annoying kid that just does some bullshit push that you think that would never work on LAN, you fucking arsehole. Like, I'm trying to practice the game, you're doing shit like that in scrims. That's what that MG guy, that's why everyone first thought he cheated, then thought it was an onliner, and then eventually just had to admit when he won everything, like, I guess he's good then. Like, it was kind of like Stewie2K in that sense. That's a good shout, actually. It's more of like a niche pick, but I can see why you went with it.
Yeah, I think that's someone. Outside of that, I'm trying to think. I actually think I think DSN could have been pretty good if like he could have just made the jump in like 2007-ish instead of like the later years of his career, when I assumed that he was spending more time playing poker than.
Well, actually, I'll echo that.
Would have been good.
Yeah, one reason I would echo that is because, first of all, even though back then it wasn't really a term, like considering DSN was a primary AWPer if he had the AWP, he could definitely be a hybrid. Like he had good rifles as well. So first of all, that would suit CSGO, where like newsflash, you don't get the AWP every fucking round, especially because people just bust your economy 24/7. And then secondly, he was also someone where the type of AWPers I think actually would make the best transition aren't the classic 1.6 like Kogu fraud, like slow AWPers. Because if you notice, that's just not
hybrids would have been.
You want the people where they just shoot really fast, basically. It's one of the reasons why me and you are actually some of the only people who know that, even though Anders made it a meme eventually, that he wanted Markov to AWP, we know why he originally, like that comes from a real place. There's a grain of truth there. His style of AWPing looks like what CSGO AWPing is, where you just fire as fast as possible. Like he just used to do that and hit like s1mple does now. Like it looks like it should have worked. That's why we always speculate it was like psychological or motivation reasons that made it.
Remember he had that one tournament in Navi, that Mad Cats, I think Vienna was the tournament where they played very games, and he went to like quad OT or something, and he was amazing in that game. But that was like the one time, and then like there was nothing else. And then 2 months later, they lost that Prague tournament to the next team, and then that team just died. Another teammate from that team, by the way, I think Gux would have been really good. Like his style would have been like perfect for CS:GO. If again, like this is assuming that these guys transfer over, roughly at their peak, give or take, as opposed to however many number of years it actually took him to get. Yeah,
he was also like, I actually did an article like maybe 5 years ago now where I tried to do this topic like early in the game, and actually my top 10, it was like a top 10 players who would have been good at CS:GO or whatever. Like I think ZywOo was like almost number one, because I just thought like, dude, your style of play, like people wouldn't even say you play wrong here. They just say you're just the best. So similarly, I think Gox was like top 5 in my list or something, because for the same reasons, this was a guy where, especially in Swedish teams, where again, Nordic teams in general, you're not really supposed to just be like selfish, like you're supposed to play for the team. That Gox guy, I've always told this story because it was one that actually Khan said. I think he even said it in either an interview or on that podcast we used to do. He once said, because again, similar complaints where like you just, what you always do with in-game leaders is you just whine about things that their teammates do that they finally get a chance to air a grievance about, because everyone except in-game leaders doesn't know what the fuck you're talking about. So a famous thing he told as an anecdote was that I said to him, dude, why do even some of the best players in the world basically never use the terrain to their advantage? So like if they have the bomb down in a 1v1 and they're the T, some of them just peek into the 1v1 and it's like, yeah, I get it that you're going to kill him if you're really skilled. But you could just win that like 99% if you make him come like backwards around a box that he doesn't know you're hiding behind. Basically what Zipnix does in CSGO. So here's the thing. Khan tried to reason with Gox about this, because Gox basically had like the skills of Forrest, but then was too aggressive. Like he went too far on like I can just take every dual angle, because he was a skilled player. So he just thought like, well, whatever. And so Khan basically said to him, tried to explain what I just described. He said, listen, you're really good. So I get it. If you take that 1v1 duel, just a gunfight for the round, you might win it 70% of the time. Like he was being generous, And Gox goes, nah, I think it'd be more like 95%. And then Khan obviously just realized in that moment, like, this is why in-game leaders don't have discussions with star players. Like, because obviously, by the way, I'm going to tell everyone a spoiler in case they don't get the punchline. I think Khan was probably being generous saying 70%. Like, if I think how close, like, good aim is, it's probably more like 55 or like 60% that they win that 1v1. Whereas in the case Khan's making, you probably 80% of the time win the 1v1 if you just play it smart. And God could actually play smart if he wanted to. But the idea, like, that's just how delusional fraggers are in a way. Like, he was like a J.R. Smith like that. Like, I'm sure if you ask J.R. Smith, he probably thinks he hits like 50% fucking three-pointers, doesn't he? Like, he just thinks that's why I really am. Like, no, the games I didn't, I was off that game, like some bullshit like that.
There's a famous Ruid story among like old people in the Finnish scene. So like Natu would know this. There was a CPL, I think winter 2004, when Ruid was playing with Astralis. They played NIP on Inferno. That was the team when like Heaton and Potty came back and made the new SK with NIP with like, I think Bilden might have been on that.
Okay, 2005.
Yeah, 2005. And there was a round when the game was something like 11-11. Astralis was on the T side, like was gonna be set with money. He had a 1-on-1 against Potty, and he was a B side of Inferno. Had planted the bomb, was by triple bucks. There's like 15 seconds left on the bomb, something like that. So Putty's like all the way back in spawn. He's kind of just looking, and it's like clear if you're watching on AGL TV that he's already decided to save, and he's just trying to see if he can get an exit. So what does Ruben do? He waits 2 seconds and he swings out, commits to the peak, loses the duel, and Putty goes in and defuses. Astralis is broke. They say they lose the game. And that's like the one round that we've always used as an example, saying like, listen, dude, like, if I just pulled your USB cord, you win that one-on-one.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of rounds in the game where, like, you know, the CT is not going to straight diffuse very often. So, like, there's a lot of rounds where, like, if you literally just hide, you win because there's not enough rounds. Like, you'd literally just go AFK. You could unplug your keyboard and you would win. And a lot of players will go for the peak because that's just it is admittedly like like, you'd rather losing an aim fight than lose because you just don't even peak.
Yeah, of course.
But like a lot of people will just lose rounds where they literally could have just gone away, gone away from their keyboard. But that's like a funny example because it's the same exact time player. But like, you know, that's a pretty brutal loss. Like that was the last tournament, I think, or not the last tournament. It's like a couple more months of tournaments after that. And then, you know, that Astralis team died. And then we built what turned out to be the best Finnish team of all time because he left that team.
Indeed. No, I mean, the funny thing is when you say that, like, that's also just like, here's the problem, right? When you come up with a principle in CS, people don't get this. Like, just being a nerd isn't enough. You've got to have like a catchy way to say it. So like, that is the best like way to evocatively phrase that. It's like rounds that you win if you unplug the keyboard, but if you keep playing the game, you might lose. Like, it's the perfect way to describe it to get the point through to someone. Because listen, mate, I've seen some of those in CSGO where someone with like 2 seconds left as a CT when the guy isn't going to get the bomb down, just peeks out and dies and loses the round. And I just think like, if I was the coach, how would I even psychologically keep it together after seeing that? Like it'd be so hard in that scenario, wouldn't it? Like, dude, if you're just taking your hands off the keyboard, we can't lose. Like, why are you peeking?
Yeah.
What about one thing I want to ask along those lines, stuff with comparing like the great players, etc., is this is where I'll actually go the other way and give a lot of credit to some of the great CSGO players. I tell you what, one thing I never thought we'd see in CSGO, and it's why when Get Right was the best for the first year or so, and Kenny S was sick at time, it's why I used to think those guys truly were like unbelievable, is CSGO was also an insanely hard game to be consistent at. And they used to literally have like 6-month spans where every tournament they were the best. In 1.6, that was, like I said, if you were a true god of the game, like a Mount Rushmore guy, that was standard. Like, if you were Neo, it was expected you were not only going to be the best on your team, that goes without saying. You better be probably the best player in the tournament because that's who you are. I tell you what, that's where this modern crop, like I said, of like s1mple, NiKo, and ZywOo, they have impressed me because holy shit, their consistency in a game that has so much variance is amazing. It's really impressive.
I think ZywOo's the biggest outlier to me personally in that, because like his team isn't even that good when you watch it. Yes. They don't appear to be that good. They don't have that, like they were really good last year for a portion of the time, but a lot of the time, like they don't even place that highly. They just have close games against everybody because they're, you know, he's very good. And like you look at his games and like he doesn't even almost have off rounds. Like he just like he just gets kills. He doesn't miss easy kills and he gets a lot of kills he shouldn't have gotten. Like it's just super impressive how consistent he can be throughout the games. You know, like I can speak from my experience where like you'd have tournaments where, you know, maybe you didn't get the right amount of play time in before or whatever, you don't feel that good. And sometimes even if you played a lot, you still sometimes like don't feel that good. And like you're just not feeling it for whatever reason. And like I've seen that happen to just about everybody. But like some of these guys, like they're just there every single round. It feels like they just don't mess up at all. Like they get all the kills every round. It's not even like, you know, you have a bad match here and there. You have, you know, one bad tournament here and there. And it's not even because they're just super passive and they have such a style that, you know, gives them a little extra comfort and makes it a little bit easier for them. Like some of these guys are like s1mple, like he's just reckless, like we said, and he still pulls it off. It's super impressive. I mean, I think that's like, and I do wonder, like, how much of that is just the fact that people are just more talented today. Like, many of the players are just, like, they just have better hand-eye coordination than players back then. I think a portion has to be that. But at the same time, you know, like I don't know whether the variance in that has increased. Put another way, like, if everybody's hand-eye coordination gets better identically, then it makes no difference, right? Because everybody's better. So actually what you need is for you to be an even bigger outlier today than you did 10 years ago to look similarly good, which is the more impressive part if you think about it that way.
Yeah, that's what makes s1mple just so bonkers, isn't it? It's like, even in a world where there's like, especially because now we've developed all these global scenes so much. So you have all these players like Nico from Bosnia, who, by the way, never would have been seen in 1.6. He would have sadly been like fucking, the example is Oscar. Like we would have only heard of him from a frag movie and gone, seems pretty good. Shim will never see him on the international stage, or he'll lose in the first round. So to be fair, we never would have had a guy like that at 1.6. But when you have us developed a scene, the idea that you can then put the gap between you and everyone else that s1mple did in 2018 is ridiculous. Like the best example ever I said then is the way I knew that s1mple had broken CSGO. It's because it's not that I thought he was the best, because I thought players in the past were the best who people disagreed with. It's when even all the fans, and even HLTV.org, which famously didn't used to give MVPs to people who weren't in the winning team, it's when even though Device won the most MVPs of the year, everyone agreed he's not the best player of the year. And I was like, dude, in 1.6, if you win every tournament of the year and you're the MVP every time, we don't even need the discussion. It's like you will just get that. Everyone will say, this was your year, you were the best. But like the idea that Device had it twice, where 2 years he won all the majors almost, like he had tons of MVPs. And at the end of the year, everyone was like, that's cool, Device, but excuse me, we're just going to go and jerk off over fucking s1mple and ZywOo or s1mple and Nico. That just shows how the game has become mad skilled.
I mean, that's the difference between being most valuable and just being the best in a team environment, right? Like, it's hard to be the most valuable if you're not winning. You just have to be that much better, and no one can really stand out on the winning team, because otherwise, by definition, you're doing more towards winning versus doing slightly more towards a second play, for example. But like some of these guys, they're just so consistent all year round that it just seems impossible.
I'll also say as well, by the way, another reason why I'm with you that ZywOo in his own way has like a unique quality is I agree with the teammate angle. Like, if you look at the others, listen, I know Nico was like a god on mouse spots, which arguably was way worse in terms of teammate quality, but here's the difference. If you look at the way Nico played in Nico spots, it's no wonder he was the IGL and even did this in phase. Right? When everyone says he frags as an IGL, let's be real, guys. It's because he doesn't really do half the fucking IGL part, isn't it? He just frags. Like, that's the joke, isn't it? But the joke is, the reason why he wants to do it still is so that he can do what he wants and not have someone else basically tell him the wrong route to run, as it were. So the problem is this. He put himself in the positions. It's one of the reasons why I'm famously more sceptical about Forrest than many other people. Forrest played the position in the game, follow-up entry fragger, that in theory should get the most kills. That should be the best position. Because the problem with being the ultimate beta, like Cold Zero style, is some rounds, if you have a really good team, will be over before you get there. So you don't even get the kills. Like, they run in the site and they kill everyone. Like, you start to get right in Forest, Forest and Gox, and then would go in the site, kill everyone, and then get right would be like, oh, well, because maybe I'll get a clutch round in a minute, Like, there's the difference. Cold Zero, Nico, Cold Zero rather, and ZywOo, I would say. At least Cold Zero had god-tier teammates when he baited everyone. Mate, ZywOo is having to essentially do that with worse teammates, a worse team, and as you say, even though he's in a lot of hard situations, he never misses. It feels like you can't rattle him.
And they also make it deep enough in the tournaments all the time that they actually play a lot of series against the good teams. Like that Mousebirds team, like they never made top four. I don't think. I think they made
did like once,
during the whole time that Nico was there. So like he was like unbelievable in group stages. Had famously had that game against Fnatic on Dust 2 where I think he hit 50 or something.
Yes, Katowice 2016.
Yeah, just like just an unbelievable talent, like very clearly. But like like you're doing that in group stages, you're, everybody, like the teams that think that they're going to beat you, like if you're that mouse sports team and you're playing against, say, Fnatic at the time, like Fnatic is not staying up preparing for you. I guess Fnatic's a bad example because they're not doing that against anybody. But, like whoever the top team is, like they're not worried about you. Like they know you're going to be really good and you're going to get yours, and they just assume that they're going to win 16-10 anyway. So like that's the difference here. Like Vitality's good enough and they play close enough against everybody that people do that and they work. They actually get to play all those series and they really prepare for them. So I think that makes it actually harder for ZywOo than, for example, Nico and some of those earlier teams, just because of that. Though, admittedly, like everybody probably spent more emphasis or more effort on stopping Nico than ZywOo, just because Vitality is more tactical.
Yes. I'd also even throw in, if we're going to contrast the games again, that's also where, in my opinion, CSGO is different. Even though we're saying the skill level can be unbelievable and obviously people play quite abusively, I think the fact that the average CS pro plays way more recklessly than the average 1.6 pro, because just the meta of the game was different and the roles were way more defined in 1.6. Like if you're the entries, you always are the entries. You don't I'm not joking. You would rotate your entries off the site you were going to fake on and go to the other one. Whereas in CSGO, people figured out if you can even entry 70% as good, you can do it way faster if I just tell you to go down, you with the lurker, right? The difference is in 1.6, you would do it like that. So as a result, even if you are the super hard carry who has like not good teammates, so like Neo's an example. I mean, listen, his teammates are way better than Nico's in mouse sports, but even so, I used to think like, dude, any championship you win compared to Forest should be worth like twice as much, mate. Look at his teammates and look at yours. The difference is, if you hard carry and you are a god in CS 1.6, you probably do win the tournament and the match. Dude, it's infamous. Obviously, s1mple did it and Nico did it, but it's become very infamous with these characters, ZywOo. Half their career is having like the best performance of the whole tournament and losing the series. Like, I feel like in CSGO that's way more common. Like, you can hard carry individually, but the team element, I mean, people just don't play as a team as much, I feel like. So you can't kind of make it work for you.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And then the other piece is like some of these guys are just from countries where, Nico's the exception because he can play with international teams. Like s1mple doesn't as easily fit in international teams, neither does ZywOo. So like you're kind of restricted by whatever the talent pool in your country happens to do. With that said, like playing against, for example, Fnatic in 2009, like that's like Golden State with KD and everybody else. That's like, like some of those years, like you just have teams that you just can't really beat. And that's been Astralis, for quite a while, was Liquid for a couple of months last year, et cetera. Like that, that happens some of the time. So like part of it is like a function of just like the era that you happen to be in. And then some of it is just that like, you just don't have the right teammates. And in that context, it's really incredible what some of the players do individually, regardless.
I actually think also, we'll make this maybe the last point because we have to wrap up soon, but that's even one reason why I think CSGO, because one thing I've noticed is different, mate, is in CSGO, to this day, the default way to recruit is just get the most skilled player. That it really is, to this day, still the approach. The logic is we'll just figure out a way to make it work. So Team Liquid last year is the best example ever, because as I pointed out, every single one of the 5 players had in the past been a star player of an NA team. Like, there's no such team like that in 1.6. That doesn't exist. Like, there's no team ever constructed like that. None of the great teams are like that. Like, that is so alien, because in the great 1.6 teams, right, the guy who's the support player is probably just a guy who played support his whole career. The guy who's an entry is an entry the whole career. Like, the roles were more set. So I actually feel like I'll contrast it to the NBA example you gave there, because everyone knows in the NBA now, the new approach is the same as in CSGO. You just stack superstars and you hope you have the right, like, fucking Voltron combination of superstars that you win the NBA title. Whereas I even think that's an example of where, everyone nowadays just bemoans that and says it's just greed and players don't understand what the game's about. No, it's also the changing meta of the game. Like in a game where you shoot 1 billion times because threes have just been figured out that you can scale them up, you can now have 3 1A options that should be 1A options on other teams on one team, like Golden State did. Whereas the difference is you wouldn't have made a team like that in the 80s because that guy probably is shooting 2-pointers and he's working like a fucking backing someone down and taking like a one-on-one fight. Like in that scenario, the other 2 people are just stood watching him. It wouldn't even make sense. That team would actually be worse. So that's another area I feel like CSGO contrasts very differently, is a lot of the game is about stacking skilled players, and then after the fact you figure out what roles are you going to do, where's he going to fit on the map, what tactics are going to do. 1.6 I felt like was a lot more about like, you need the guy who can do that job, because as we said, a lot of the executes you got to know your part of it perfectly, basically. You're not just doing it half the time. Yeah,
that's for sure. And I think we even see this today. I mean, like I think the way Liquid went about their roster changes, they dropped the player who had the least individual skill and they picked a star player from an upcoming team. Grim came from Triumph, I think. That's the Kevin Garnett team. And like, I've actually seen him play quite a bit because, been stuck in LA through coronavirus, and there was a lot of Counter-Strike going on all day, 24/7 until the player break. So I always had the games on in the background and just playing super well. So he probably just earned himself the spot right there. But that's like another example of, you just pick the most skill and you hope that there's going to be a way to make all that work and make the pieces fit together. I will say that there is one upside to the stacking skill on a roster approach, regardless of like what the implications are and how the pieces fit together and teamwork, etc., which is that like, all else equal, you'd always rather have the Houston Rockets approach, which is that you just have super high variance because at least you have a shot that way. If you're just consistently worse, like nobody else in the West the last couple of years, just to go back to basketball, is beating Golden State, Rocket's like, they're like a couple of threes away from knocking them down, even with CP3 out in game 7 a couple of years ago. And that's because they understand that, like, if you're worse, if you play a 100-game series, you're always losing, then you just have to make it more random. Yes. And I think if you have more skill, then, like, yeah, it could go wrong, could go horribly wrong because you don't have the basics of team play, etc. But at the same time, you also have chances of winning. And, people generally would prefer to win a big one every now and then rather than always make top 4. There's, good examples from that from over the years.
Put it this way, the analogy would be this, Lurppis. There's a reason why playing the national lottery is more appealing to some people than the scratch ticket, even though they might cost the same and you have a way higher chance of winning something on the scratch ticket. Because the logic is, like you're saying, if you're going to win, I want to win it all. I don't want to win like fucking £100 or something, do I? Like, if I'm being an idiot, I may as well go for the million or whatever. Like, that's weird. So in similar fashion, yeah, I'm with you. Like, put it this way, it's one of the reasons why oftentimes when I like a team, because they remind me of 1.6, like MSL teams are an obvious example, or even maybe the mouse sports team that Carrigan has now, because I always say these teams have just enough skill. Well, the downside of having just enough skill is when some of your players are off their game, you're just never going to win. You just can't win the tournament. Whereas, as we're saying, like Team Liquid's a good example. I mean, I'm amazed they haven't won anything since that player break, but they almost feel like they could have tripped over and won a tournament if things had gone right. I mean, EG did, right? Similar kind of team. So, yeah, I'm with you. In that sense, that is also another strategy if you aren't the number one team, is to just stack that approach and go variance, yeah. And definitely some CSGO teams have done it.
Yep.
This video was kindly supported by Pronogo, Whattathings, Spencer Green, Soliko, Dean Tanglis, Jack Hanna, Hades, Jensen Go, the Puyol Up Tribe, J-Dubs, Tobias Bernasconi, Alexander Rao, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you'd like to put a question to me in my monthly video AMA. Do you want teasers for my upcoming content? Or maybe to even take part in an online esports discussion with moi? Well, if so, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today in the Patreon link in the description box below.